Hello there and welcome along to the industry analysis for the management case study of May 2019. Here we're going to be looking at the prefabricated housing industry in the real world, and we're going to be drawing some implications, some lessons, some insights from the real world industry that you can hopefully use then for anticipating some of the issues that might arise on exam day for the case study exam in May. Before we begin, let's just have a quick overview of what we'll be covering in this industry analysis. We're going to start with a very general market overview. We're going to be looking at some key figures, trends pertaining to things like growth, for example, and also some structural issues pertaining to this market. From there, then we're going to focus more on the demand side. We'll be looking at some customer trends, some key drivers in this industry, and various other forces which affect demand within the industry, broadly speaking. From there, then we're moving into some more specifics. We're looking at the internal workings of this industry and looking at the manufacturing processes typical of the industry and some of the key materials as well that are used and why that's important, especially in this prefabricated housing industry. In section 4, we're going to focus on regulations, which are potentially very important in this industry, and we'll see why exactly that's the case. In section 5, we're going to look at one example of a real-world company that I think has many similarities with the pre-seen company of Jord Homes, and we'll see why. And then in section 6, we're going to talk about some opportunities and threats based on everything that we've been talking about in the preceding sections, drawing all of that together, and that'll bring us to the conclusion then of our industry analysis. We also include at the end of this PowerPoint presentation all of the sources that we have relied on in bringing this together, and that you can do a deep dive on in your own time if you wish to do so after watching this industry analysis. Okay, so let's start with this market overview. Here we're looking at the global perspective, and these are just some key points to take away from the market in a global sense. Looking at growth figures in the first point here, you can see the global prefabricated construction market is expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of around 6% during the period 2018 to 2022. So that's quite a healthy compound annual growth rate for a 4-year period. So it's looking good for the prefabricated construction market. Point number two here is looking at the key drivers. One of them is the rise in global construction and infrastructure development activities in general, and of course that pertains especially to developing market and emerging markets, for example in China, India and in Latin America as well. And point number 3 here, a key trend which is influencing this industry is the adoption of what are called dry construction techniques. And dry construction techniques simply means relying on things that do not require, for example, cement and traditional bricklaying, for example, which requires certain kinds of wet materials to be used. Dry construction techniques rely more on prefabricated materials, and of course, unsurprisingly then, that is influencing this particular industry. The more popular those kinds of techniques become in general, the more that's going to create growth opportunities for the prefabricated construction industry as a whole. But the key number to remember there is the compound annual growth rate of around 6% projected towards 2022. We're going to focus primarily here on the EU market in terms of looking at some more fine-grained numbers and figures. The reason being, of course, that the company in the pre-scene is based in a fictional country, which is, however, in Europe. So we do know that it's some kind of European country. It's modelled on some real European country, probably. It takes elements from a number of different European countries. But whatever the case, it is definitely important to look at the European context when studying the real world industry in order to get a sense of where things are likely to go in the coming years as well. So with that in mind, let's take a look at this useful little chart here. This is again projections to 2020. And we're looking at compound annual growth rates both for the value of the market overall and in terms of the quantity of prefabricated houses coming onto the market. And as you can see there, in terms of value, we're seeing the biggest compound annual growth rate of 7.7% from 2014 to 2020. So again, pretty healthy numbers there. And it's expected to continue beyond, as we saw, into 2022, globally speaking. And in terms of quantities, you can see then up there, you've got a quantity, 5.4% roughly in terms of quantity growth to 2020. So both in terms of value and in terms of quantity, we're looking at positive numbers, but we'll explain a little bit more about why the value of the market is outstripping somewhat the quantity growth in a few slides. We'll see a little bit more detail in that respect. So here you can see the market volume of 1 and 2 family housing. 1 and 2 family housing is basically another way of talking about detached and semi-detached houses. That is to say, the detached house is one that is freestanding, a standalone house intended for one family. And 2 family housing is basically units that are constructed such that they can accommodate 2 families. In other words, they are semi-detached houses in the traditional sense. So we're looking here at the market volume for both of those kinds of houses. Overall, it's expected to continue its growth between 2017 and 2022. This is again in the European context, but at a slower pace than the prefabricated housing industry. As we'll see, we're looking here at 2% per annum from 2017 to 2022 if you look at the text here in the right column. So that is the housing market overall. But when we look then, by contrast, at the prefabricated housing industry, in particular for 1 and 2 family houses, we're looking at an annual growth of 3%, so 3% per annum growth from 2017 to 2022. Now that might seem quite marginal in terms of just a 1% difference, but you got to remember that is 1% difference per annum, so that's going to compound over the years into a significant difference. So that indicates that the prefabricated housing market is actually growing at a faster rate, at least within this segment of 1 plus 2 family houses, growing at a faster rate than is the general market for 1 and 2 family houses. That's taking in regular traditional construction methods, on-site construction methods. So that is obviously a very healthy signifier for this market going forward to 2022. The market value as well of prefabricated 1 and 2 family housing is projected to grow faster than the volume growth, as we saw, due to favourable pricing trends for various reasons. And one of the key reasons here on the right, as you can see, is the shift towards what are called turnkey solutions with 20 to 30% higher average prices and therefore greater value added versus what are called floor covering finishes. So the difference between turnkey and floor covering is basically that if a turnkey solution or a turnkey finish is a house, a prefabricated house that comes with all of the fittings and furnishings and appliances included. The idea here is that you can simply turn the key and the house is ready. So it's an entirely finished house from start to finish. All the furniture is included, all of the finishings are included, all of the appliances are included, the electrics, the plumbing, and all of that is included. Whereas the floor covering simply includes surface finishes and indeed some of those plumbing and electronics as well. So the turnkey solutions, it seems, are growing at a much faster rate than the other versions within this segment versus floor covering, for example, and that is accounting for that increased value because they can charge, of course, higher prices for turnkey solutions, and it's looking like turnkey solutions are becoming increasingly popular within the prefabricated industry as a whole. So that is a really important development from the perspective of a company like the one we're dealing with in the pre-scene. That is also very important and indeed potentially beneficial because, of course, they specialize in those kinds of turnkey solutions where every single feature, every single furnishing is thought of, is planned, is included in the costing and is delivered to the customer at the end. So a really important development in that respect for a company like Jord. Turnkey solutions as well, they account for more than 50% of the prefabricated 1 and 2 family housing market in Europe and are forecast to outgrow the market in general. So again, another indication there that these turnkey solutions in which you can simply turn the key once you're finished and everything is ready to go, everything is all there for you, are becoming increasingly popular and already account for the majority of the prefabricated detached and semi-detached housing market. Here's an interesting point, which is interest rates and their potential impact on this particular market. Currently, they are at a historically low level in the European context, and they're expected to moderately increase from 2019, that is this year, onwards. Now, why is this particularly relevant? Well, you can see here there's one manufacturer who is quoted as saying expected interest rate increases will mostly impact the low price segment of the prefabricated industry, as these people are most reliant on cheap loans. And again, that is very telling and significant for a company like the one we're dealing with in the pre-scene, because of course Jord Homes is catering almost exclusively to the higher end and the higher price segment of the prefabricated housing market, and for that reason this is good news. Even if there are interest rate rises, it's unlikely to really negatively impact a company like Jord Homes, and it's more likely to impact some of the lower end prefabricated housing companies. Market entry barriers are important to consider in this industry, particularly, of course, from a competitive point of view and from a competitor point of view. A company like Jord, of course, is always going to prefer a situation, as with any company in any industry, in which competition is kept to a minimum. It's perhaps a little bit less of a concern, of course, for the premium and luxury manufacturers, because, of course, they have more of an interest in internally restricting their own supply, and for that reason, perhaps the pressures of competitive entry are a little bit lower, but still, of course, it's always going to be better, other things being equal, that fewer new entrants come on the scene. And so we can see here what those particular barriers to entry are in terms of their relevance. You can see here on the right, you have a little pie chart which indicates the degree of relevance of the particular barrier. And the first one here, the most relevant one, is technical capabilities. Suppliers of prefabricated houses have to cover a broad spectrum of specialities and capabilities, for example, architecture and housing design trends, construction and engineering, pre-production and on-site assembly, project planning and execution, in order to match customers' high quality demand and price expectations. So as you would have seen in the pre-scene, there's a great degree of vertical integration in some of these companies. They include so many different steps. It's really a one-stop shop, and for that reason there is a real barrier in terms of compiling and getting together all of the technical capabilities and capacities that one needs in order to set up a company like Jord Homes, or a prefabricated housing company that is effective and that is well coordinated. So that's a huge barrier to entry right there. Another important barrier to entry is sales networks and channels. The establishment of a comprehensive and attractive online channel is required, providing detailed building specifications, pictures, videos, configuration tools, and showcases. That's important as well from a marketing point of view, of course, and we're going to talk a little bit more about marketing towards the end of this industry analysis as well. Brand and track record, of course, are always going to be important, as in any industry, and capital intensity is an issue here because, of course, we're talking about big manufacturing facilities in the case of many of these companies. That's going to require a lot of capital investment, and of course, that's yet another barrier to entry. We're looking here at the prevalence of high-end versus low-end houses within the prefabricated housing market in general, and we're looking at the some particular nations within the European context, some of the most important markets for prefabricated housing in the European context, and looking at the breakdown. You can see here at the bottom we've got price segments broken down as 250,000 plus euros for a home, between 150 and 250,000 euros, and then under 150,000 euros as well for a prefabricated house. And as you can see in the case of the UK, the overwhelming majority of the new houses that are being prefabricated are in the middle to high price ranges. And you'll see if you look through these other countries, Switzerland here, that's again reflected a similar kind of pattern. The majority, vast majority indeed, in the Swiss context are very high end, 250,000 plus. Of course, that may well reflect the general higher prices in Switzerland's economy as a whole, but also you see the same in Scandinavian countries. The vast majority of prefabricated houses are upper end or mid-range, 150,000 plus. The same again in Germany. You can see a huge majority are either above 150,000 or above 250,000 euros. And Austria is again no different, a slightly higher percentage, under 150,000, but still the majority are in the higher price ranges. And the only exception is in the Polish market, which is, to some extent at least, a developing market still, and that may explain the reason why we're seeing a prevalence of under 150,000 prefabricated homes. But all of that, again, within the European context at least, is good news for a company like Jord, because of course they're relying on high price segment, and it looks like there's no danger that demand in the high price segments in many of those European markets is going to be declining anytime soon, and indeed the trends seem to be pretty steady that they're going to continue to be majority share going to high price segments. We're looking now in section 2 at demand issues pertaining to customers in particular and some of the key drivers and forces underlying demand. The prefabricated housing market volume and price are expected to be favourably or positively driven by a number of key trends. Here I'm going to focus on those that pertain specifically to the prefabricated industry, because there are some other drivers that generally apply to the housing market overall, but I'm more interested in those that are driving a demand due to the specific nature of the prefabricated industry and offerings themselves. The first one here is planning security. Customers increasingly value planning security regarding budget and move-in date, and prefab constructions usually outperform the traditional solid or on-site construction processes. As we saw in the pre-scene, that's one of the key attractions of this method of house construction, is that you can get the costs, very detailed cost plans prior to actually the build of the house going ahead, so that you can plan and control costs more effectively, and you're not going to be hit with any nasty surprises or unexpected costs being tacked on further down the line. Most of these prefabricated housing companies, they lock in those costs at the time of signing the contract, and that gives a huge amount of peace of mind to customers, of course, and a great deal of security going forward as the house build begins. So that's a huge factor here, as you can see, in terms of relevance. That's one of the most important right across the board in all of the European markets. Another pertains to the turnkey solutions. The fact that they're a one-stop shop solution is really, really attractive as well, it seems. Again, you can see the relevance of that particular force or driving factor. And as it says, one partner from design to construction facilitates the entire process, and that is, of course, the company, the prefabricated housing company in question, and thereby reduces the possibility of errors, especially for individuals, and of course, the headaches associated with coordination. If you are actually in charge of building a house yourself and having to contract all the different parties, the architects and the contractors and electricians and plumbers and so on and so forth, if that's your responsibility, that is a huge headache in terms of coordination, in terms of things like costs and planning. And with a company like Jord or any other real world company in this industry, they take on that burden and they get rid of that stress for you. So that's a huge attraction as well. And another important factor here in terms of relevance is technology acceptance. The technology acceptance for prefabricated houses is increasing across focus regions, that is to say in the European markets. And prefab houses are increasingly seen to be modern. Now, we're going to come back to that because I think perception is a tricky issue here, especially when it comes to, for example, those higher end or premium manufacturers within the prefabricated housing market, such as Jord Homes and, as we'll see later on, Hoofhouse. And there is a delicate balance, I think, that needs to be struck there in terms of trying to popularize this technology and also maintaining some degree of exclusivity for the higher end players within the industry. Market feedback here, we've got some interesting qualitative analysis based on some surveys that were performed, and we see here some very interesting customer feedback in particular. Here's one customer in Germany. On the left you can see, I value the reliability of the house cost estimations. Once the contract is signed, the house price is fixed. In Scandinavia, we see one customer, when deciding on my house, I was in contact with 5 companies. all of them provided me with detailed information on potential move-in dates. Planning security was definitely a strong criterion for my choice. Here's a customer from the UK. Knowing the exact move-in date helped us to plan and organise moving out of our previous home. Additionally, we appreciated the possibility to agree upon a reliable house construction budget up front. And in Austria and Switzerland, I would always prefer a prefabricated house after having had horrible experiences with architects not meeting deadlines. You can see the overarching theme there is reliability in planning, cost, and deadlines. Those are the key drivers in this market, and they are going to be pushing demand increasingly towards this segment in the coming years, taking more and more of a market share from the traditional methods of construction and house building in general. So really important to keep those kinds of comments and feedback in mind, because those are going to be key selling points for any company within this sector. The OneStop Solution is very important as well. And you can see here some more customer reports and feedback. Here's a customer from Switzerland. When I decided for my second home in Switzerland, I just wanted to have one point of contact. For me, it was of utmost importance that my involvement in the process was limited. As a businessman, I simply do not have the time. So being able to outsource the stress of planning and coordination and dealing with all the different parties necessary to get a house built from start to finish, that really is a huge draw for this industry. And another customer here on the right, building a house and organising all necessary process steps can be quite cumbersome. I really appreciated having one point of contact that guides me through the process. And you can see also some other comments interesting there from manufacturers and market experts if you want to look in your own time in terms of their perception of the benefits of the one-stop solution. But I think from a customer and demand point of view, those two comments there are very telling indeed. This is a key selling point, another key competitive advantage that these kinds of companies have over the traditional methods of house building. Now, customer perceptions, we touched on this a little bit earlier. This is a really important point, I think, from the marketing point of view, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. But some do still associate prefabricated homes with cheap or temporary dwellings. I don't know about some of you, but certainly when I was younger, I do recall the word prefab being associated with cold, damp, poorly insulated, makeshift structures that were often used, in fact, in my schools growing up. When the schools were being extended or being worked on, we had to go to prefabs in order to do our classes as a temporary measure, and they always had this kind of grey, cheap association. So I think that certainly is a perception and a psychological association that persists in many countries, I think indeed in European countries especially. So the word prefab, even especially in its abbreviated form, I think has those negative connotations. And so that's something that needs to be addressed and dealt with, I think, by a lot of the companies within this segment. There's also, I think, still some confusion regarding the difference between mobile homes and modular homes. And modular is a word that is used interchangeably with prefabricated homes. Both of those terms, prefabricated and modular, seem to have some downsides or negative associations. And in the case of modular, some people think that modular is just a synonym for mobile homes. And of course, mobile homes have negative connotations with being cheap or being something that perhaps is used for holidays but not as permanent dwellings. And so those, again, are conceptual issues that I think need to be considered very seriously by companies in this segment, especially if they want to see the growth of recent years continue and indeed accelerate. However, interestingly, visually, surveys have shown that individuals can actually rarely tell the difference between a modular home or a prefabricated home and a traditional site-built home. So despite those negative associations that people have when they hear words like modular homes and words like prefabricated homes or prefab, it remains the case that actually when it comes to looking at these homes, people are unaware of the fact that some homes that are prefabricated are in fact prefabricated. And so it's an interesting little kind of contradiction there, that they have these negative associations with modular and prefab homes, and yet they're not able even to even distinguish them visually from traditional construction methods. So that is something I think that needs to be leveraged, the fact that the appearance of prefabricated and modular homes is actually really impressive and really good when compared to traditional construction methods, and indistinguishable indeed. So I think a lot of people are unaware of that fact, and that needs to be put front and center when it comes to things like marketing. So now we're moving into the nuts and bolts of the industry. We're looking at some of the manufacturing issues and processes, and indeed materials and the importance of materials within this industry. I think lean manufacturing is really a key in this industry. Based on looking at various real-world companies, you come away with a strong impression that lean manufacturing is really central, and it is something that is almost necessary within this industry, rather than something of a luxury or something that is a kind of a competitive advantage over others within the industry. It really is becoming a standard. Most modern prefabricated housing companies rely, at least to some extent, on lean manufacturing principles. And what is lean manufacturing, in case you've forgotten from your E1 studies? This is the production and management philosophy that considers any part of the enterprise which does not directly add value to the final product to be superfluous. In other words, it is not necessary. Lean manufacturing focuses on value creation and the elimination of waste and non-essential processes. A key aspect of this is in the prefab context in particular is what is called design for manufacture and assembly, or DFMA. And what is this DFMA, in case you haven't come across it yet? It's the combination of two related methodology. Design for manufacture is the first part, which means the design for ease of manufacture of the parts that will form a product. So in other words, this is the idea that when a product is being designed, the designers are actually aware of how this is going to be manufactured and whether or not it's actually going to be relatively easy to manufacture. So the idea here is that you don't design something that is almost impossible or really, really costly and difficult to actually manufacture, and that the manufacturing processes available inform and to some extent at least constrict and determine what kinds of designs are allowed or are permissible or acceptable. So this means that there has to be a really close kind of interconnectivity and collaboration process between the manufacturers on the one hand and the designers on the other hand. Design for assembly then is a similar concept, except in this case we're thinking of the designers are thinking of the ease of assembly of the final product. So you've got the manufacture of the individual components and parts first, and then you have the actual assembly or putting together of the manufactured parts. And so the design team also needs to be able to think ahead as to whether or not what they're going to be producing and what they've designed for production is going to be easy and relatively cost-free to assemble. So those two ideas together form this idea of DFMA, and DFMA then of course is central to executing successfully the lean manufacturing philosophy. Now, there are some interesting points to bear in mind here in terms of potential limitations and conflicts that might arise as a result of really trying to enforce the DFMA idea too rigidly or too strictly. It can place restrictions on things, for example, like customization for customers, and it does raise potential issues in terms of design priorities. So think of the question here: are we designing for the customer, or are we designing primarily for ease of manufacturing for ourselves? Which should take priority? So that is actually a really interesting managerial and indeed strategic question to consider here. You might be thinking, well, it's pretty straightforward. When you want to have lean manufacturing, you've got to design things in a way that will maximize cost saving, reduce the amount of waste in manufacturing, make it as easy as possible to manufacture and as easy as possible to assemble. But then you've got to bear in mind, of course, that you do have a customer to take into account as well, and it might well be that there is actually a conflict between what the customer wants on the one hand in terms of design and what that implies in terms of whether or not it's actually easy to manufacture and easy to assemble, and whether it actually is consistent with the procedures and indeed the technologies that are in place existing within the company already that allow for certain kinds of things to be created and certain kinds of things to be assembled. So an interesting point to bear in mind there, and a potential conflict that could arise for a company indeed like Jord Homes in terms of their customization and the degree to which they want to tailor their designs as much as possible to the desires and to the aesthetic wishes of their customers.